Hi, welcome. This is a short presentation for the implementation of HTML5 validation project for the OSS part of the Object-Oriented Design and Development class at NC State. So HTML5 form validation means that when an HTML page is loaded and there are a few input fields or a few text fields, and they have attributes which need to which according to which the input needs to conforms to, then we need to make sure that this is done, and we need to implement a mechanism which makes sure that the input stays according to the rules. So this the HTML5 form validation which we are implementing is being currently done on the Servo browser. Servo is a prototype browser which is being developed by Mozilla along with the open source community, and so right now we are implementing the HTML5 validation part of that. So let's take a quick example at how HTML5 validation works. So I have a sample HTML here, and one of the input elements has the required attribute in it. So, and if I do not give it any input and try to submit the form, then it gives me a notification in Chrome that please fill out this field. So this is the kind of validation which we need to implement in Servo as well. So this particular one is an example of HTML5 form validation in its simplest form. So for our project, we need to implement this for Servo. So the initial steps which we completed were to ensure that there exists a framework through which it can be done. So for example, if there's an error with value mismatch, or if there's an error with too long, how do we differentiate between those? So how we did that was to create a enum which showed the current state of the form, which meant that if a required attribute doesn't have input, then it shows that there's value missing and the state is currently in the value missing form. But if an input which has a range or which has a restriction on the length of the input is being given an input which exceeds that length, then the form is in the too long validity state. So we implemented this enum, and this through this enum is how we'll represent the state of the form. So this is how we completed the framework in the initial steps. Now, as part of the subsequent steps, we implemented the actual method that would take the input value, check if it satisfies any of the conditions required for this, and show it to the user that there's invalid input being provided to the form, and you need to make this change in order for it to work. So instead of trying to navigate through the code and trying to explain where we changed it, I think it would be better if we take a look at an example which clearly shows the functionality of how this is being done. So right now, let's say I have prepared an simple HTML file in which there's one input element with a required attribute, there's one text area element with a required attribute, and then there's a few other attributes for it with minimum length and maximum length of the input, and then there's a number with the range through which the input can be, and then there's a step element in which the input can only be multiples of 3.11. So this is an example form on which I'll show different kind of validations now. So if we go ahead and run the HTML5 form. Right now, there is no input provided for these two elements, but in fact they actually do require the input. So once I try to submit the form, it shows me here that the error that the value is missing in these two elements. So this is how value missing works, because since we have the required attribute but we haven't provided any required any input for those elements, that's why this error shows up. So let's say we provide some kind of input to this element, and then since the range of this is 10 to 20, now that we've seen how value missing invalid state looks like, let's take a look at, say, too long or too short. So let's say I give it an input which is too short, which is supposed to be 10 characters, but it's only 3. So if I submit the form, as you can see, the form is not being consumed right now, and it shows the error that the too short HTML, that the input for this is too short. So let's say I give it the proper input, and let's take a look at some other invalid state. Let's say range underflow, which means that for the number, if with a range of 18 to 99, I'm giving it an input of, say, 4. So once I try to submit this form, it shows that the range underflow in error has happened for the input element. So that's one other state. And so let's say we want to look at another invalidity, say step mismatch, in which the input can only be multiple of a certain number. So let's take a look at how that would work. So right now this says that it should only be input of step 3.11. So let's say we give it 3.4. and we try to submit it. So it shows that there's a step mismatch HTML input element invalidating that. So in this way we can have different invalidations, and we have implemented the code for a few other as well, such as range overflow, which if it exceeds the range, then this is given, and few others such as pattern mismatch or type mismatch, which are given for emails and URLs, ensuring that we get the right kind of email and not any garbage value. So as you can see that these invalidations have been implemented, and also like if you give it the proper input, then the form should be consumed, which is what happens in this case. So if you give it 3.11, now the form should be consumed and the values should disappear, which is what happens exactly. So this is how we've implemented the HTML5 form validations, and so right now the output is being showing on the console, and showing it as part of the DOM is of a different project in the open source server implementation. So this is how we've implemented it, and that concludes the presentation for the OSS project. Thank you.